the secrets he kept. The rain tapped against the window like a soft whisper, a deceptive calm in the middle of the storm brewing inside her. Eleanor Grayson sat at the dining table, her gaze fixed on the crisp white papers spread before her. The ink was bold, the words clear: divorce settlement. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the letters of her name on the document. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of laughter, of whispered secrets, of trusting the man she thought she knew. 5 years of lies. The mansion felt colder than ever, the chandeliers above casting long, eerie shadows on the polished floors. It used to feel like a home. Now, it was nothing more than an empty prison, and she was about to walk away from it. She reached for the pen, inhaling sharply. A knock at the door made her pause. Her lawyer, Richard Calloway, stepped inside. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Hesitation, concern, something he didn't want to say. She frowned. "What is it?" Richard didn't sit. He placed a thick manila envelope on the table, his fingers tapping against it as if debating whether to hand it over. "This arrived today," he said finally. "It's about Nathaniel." Her heart skipped a beat. Nathaniel. The man she had once loved. The man she had once trusted with everything. She reached for the envelope, her hands feeling ice cold against the paper, and then she opened it. The first thing she saw was a photograph. A younger Nathaniel, his familiar dark hair, his piercing blue eyes. But he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, beautiful, breathtaking. Long auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, her emerald green eyes glowing with life. She was smiling, soft, serene, like she belonged beside him. Eleanor had never seen her before. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard exhaled slowly. Her name was Isabel Montgomery. Was. The past tense made Eleanor's breath catch. She looked back at the picture, her pulse quickening. The way Nathaniel's arm was wrapped around the woman's waist, the way she leaned into him. This wasn't just an acquaintance. This woman had been important to him, and Eleanor had never even known she existed. She turned to Richard, demanding answers. What happened to her? Richard hesitated, his fingers curled into a fist against the table. She died. The room fell silent. Eleanor stared at him, unblinking. How? His jaw tightened, under mysterious circumstances. A slow, creeping dread curled around her spine. Eleanor knew Nathaniel better than anyone, or at least she thought she had. But if that was true, why had he never mentioned Isabel? Why had he erased her from his past? A sickening thought settled in her chest. Had she just spent 5 years married to a man with a dead woman's shadow hanging over him? She reached deeper into the envelope. More documents, more photographs. And then, at the very bottom, a letter. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink slightly smudged. She began to read. He's not who you think he is. He lied before. He will lie again. And if you try to leave, he will make sure you never do. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. The letter wasn't signed, no name, no return address, but the message was clear. Nathaniel had secrets. Secrets that someone had tried to warn her about. And now, she was leaving him, just like Isabel had tried to. Her hands clenched around the paper as a cold realization settled in her bones. She needed to find out the truth before it was too late. Sleep was impossible. She sat in her dimly lit study, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating the deep worry etched into her face. Nathaniel had always been private about his past. He avoided talking about his family, his childhood, his past lovers. Now she knew why. Her fingers trembled as she typed into the search bar. Isabel Montgomery Nathaniel Grayson. Dozens of articles flashed onto the screen. Headlines, old news reports. Her breath hitched as she clicked the first one. Wealthy heiress Isabel Montgomery found dead in her home. Case closed due to lack of evidence. Fiancé Nathaniel Grayson declared innocent. No charges filed. Suspicion lingers over Isabel's tragic death. Did Nathaniel Grayson get away with murder? The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she couldn't move. Nathaniel had been engaged before. His fiancée had died. And somehow, he had walked away without a single consequence. Her mind reeled. Had she been blind all these years? Had she married a killer? Her stomach churned as she scrolled through the articles, devouring every detail. The timeline was disturbing. Isabel's death had been ruled accidental, but whispers of domestic troubles had circulated. Nathaniel had been questioned. There had been suspicions, but nothing had been proven. And now, here she was, another woman trying to leave him. Eleanor's breath came fast and shallow. The envelope, the warning letter. Had it been sent by someone who knew what he was capable of? Suddenly, a noise echoed through the house. A soft creak. Eleanor's head snapped up, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She wasn't alone. The study door was ajar, just a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. Her hands tightened around the desk. Had she forgotten to lock the front door? Or had it never been locked at all? She reached for her phone, gripping it tightly. Her eyes flickered toward the shadows, every hair on her skin standing on edge. Another noise, a slow, deliberate footstep. And then, a voice, smooth and low, slithering through the silence. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" Her blood ran cold. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the dim light. He wasn't supposed to be home. She forced herself to stay calm, her fingers tightening around the phone in her lap. I couldn't sleep," she said, swallowing hard. "I was just reading." A slow smile curved his lips, but there was something off about it, something dangerous. Nathaniel took a step forward, his eyes glinting in the dim glow of the screen. "Reading about what?" he murmured. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Did he know? Had he seen the articles? She forced a small, casual shrug. Just some old news stories. Nathaniel studied her, his gaze unwavering. And then he leaned in, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Is there something you want to ask me, darling?" Eleanor's throat dried. She knew, at that moment, this wasn't the man she thought she had married. And if she wasn't careful, she might not live long enough to sign those divorce papers. Eleanor sat frozen, her pulse a deafening roar in her ears. Nathaniel's presence filled the study, his shadow stretching long against the walls. He hadn't moved, but she felt trapped, as if an invisible force had wrapped around her throat, making it impossible to breathe. His question lingered in the air. "Is there something you want to ask me, darling?" She forced a slow, steady breath. Think. Panic would only get her killed. With practiced ease, she let out a soft, nervous laugh. "You startled me," she murmured, looking away, trying to appear flustered rather than terrified. "I was just reading random articles. Couldn't sleep." Nathaniel tilted his head, his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, she feared he would call her bluff. Then he smiled. That same charming smile she had once fallen for. But now it felt like a trap. He leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. "You always did get lost in your thoughts at night." His gaze flickered toward her laptop. "What were you reading?" Eleanor's stomach twisted. She couldn't let him see the screen. "Nothing important," she said quickly, slamming the laptop shut. "Just news articles." Nathaniel's eyes darkened slightly at the abrupt motion. His fingers tapped against the wooden frame of the door. "Anything interesting?" Eleanor fought to keep her expression neutral. If she said too much, he'd know. If she lied outright, he'd sense it. So she shrugged, playing it off. Just an old case. A woman who... She stopped herself, forcing a small, dismissive shake of her head. "It doesn't matter. It's late." Nathaniel stepped closer. Too close. Her pulse spiked as he lifted a hand and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, deceptively gentle. "I hate when you keep secrets from me, Eleanor," he murmured, his fingers grazing the side of her neck before trailing down to her shoulder. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Secrets, he knew, or at the very least he suspected. She forced herself to relax under his touch, offering a small smile. "I would never keep secrets from you." Nathaniel held her gaze for a beat longer, searching. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Good." And just like that, the tension snapped as he turned away. "Come to bed soon," he said over his shoulder as he walked out. "We have a big day tomorrow." The moment he disappeared down the hall, Eleanor exhaled sharply, her lungs burning from the effort of holding herself together. Her fingers trembled as she reopened her laptop. The article on Isabel's death stared back at her. She had to find out the truth, and she had to do it fast, before she ended up just like her. Eleanor barely slept. By the time morning arrived, her exhaustion was a dull ache behind her eyes. But she couldn't afford to rest. Nathaniel had planned something for today, and she needed to figure out what. When she entered the dining room, breakfast was already served. A lavish spread of eggs, toast, and fresh fruit covered the table. Nathaniel sat at the head, drinking his coffee as if everything was normal, as if he hadn't stood in her doorway last night, testing her. "Sleep well?" he asked casually, flipping through the newspaper. Eleanor slid into her seat, forcing a nod. "Of course." Nathaniel smirked, as if amused by her attempt at normalcy. "We have dinner reservations tonight," he said, sipping his coffee. "A new place just opened downtown. Thought we could celebrate." She blinked. "Celebrate what?" Nathaniel's eyes gleamed. "Us." A slow dread coiled in her stomach. This wasn't a romantic gesture. This was a performance, and she was the audience. "Of course," she murmured, masking her unease. Nathaniel smiled. "Good." The conversation drifted to meaningless topics. Weather, the stock market, anything but the gaping hole of secrets between them. Eleanor went along with it, pretending. Pretending she wasn't unraveling every memory, searching for signs she had missed. Pretending she didn't feel like a fly caught in a web. But beneath the table, her hands curled into fists. She wouldn't let him control this narrative. If he wanted a game, she would play it, and she would win. The restaurant was exquisite. Dimly lit chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished floors. Soft music played in the background, an elegant contrast to the storm raging inside Eleanor's mind. She had spent the entire day preparing for this moment. If Nathaniel was planning something, she needed to get ahead of it. She had called Richard earlier that afternoon, telling him about the letter, about Isabel, about everything. He had agreed. They needed proof. They needed something that could expose Nathaniel. And tonight, Eleanor would get it. Nathaniel pulled out her chair, his fingers lingering on her shoulder as she sat. He ordered wine, a 1956 Bordeaux, their usual, except he had always preferred whiskey. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Why the sudden change? Nathaniel swirled his glass, watching her carefully, waiting. The air between them was a silent battlefield. Eleanor lifted her own glass, offering a small toast. "To us," she murmured. Nathaniel's lips curled, a silent amusement in his gaze. "To us." They drank. And then a woman approached their table. Eleanor didn't recognize her, but Nathaniel did. His grip on his glass tightened for the briefest second. and that told her everything. The woman smiled, but there was something sharp beneath it. "Nathaniel?" she purred. "It's been a while." Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but Eleanor felt the shift. "Victoria," he greeted smoothly. Victoria. Who was she? Eleanor kept her face blank, observing. Victoria's eyes flickered to Eleanor, her smile widening. "And you must be the wife." Eleanor met her gaze, tilting her head. "And you must be someone important." Victoria's lips twitched. A game within a game. Nathaniel chuckled, but his fingers tapped once against the table, a warning. Eleanor ignored it. "Actually," Victoria continued, "I knew Nathaniel a long time ago." Eleanor leaned forward, intrigued. "Oh? Do tell." Victoria's gaze flickered toward Nathaniel, watching for a reaction. And when he gave none, she smirked. "I was there," she said, her voice dripping with meaning. Eleanor's blood went cold. "There?" she echoed. Victoria's eyes gleamed. The night Isabel Montgomery died. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Eleanor's heartbeat thundered. This was it. This was the crack she needed. She smiled sweetly. "Do go on." Victoria met her gaze, something almost approving in her smirk. Nathaniel reached for his wine, his expression smooth, controlled. But Eleanor saw it, the momentary flicker of fear, and for the first time, she knew she wasn't the only one playing a game. Nathaniel was hiding something. And Victoria? She had just given Eleanor the key to unlocking it. Eleanor's fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of her wineglass, her knuckles turning white. The restaurant's warm golden lights suddenly felt too dim, the air too thick. Victoria Montgomery leaned back in her chair, her smirk sharp like a blade. "I was there the night Isabel died." Nathaniel didn't flinch, but Eleanor felt the tension ripple beneath his smooth exterior. This was a test, a power play. Victoria wasn't here by accident. Eleanor had spent 5 years with Nathaniel, studying every subtle tick, every controlled expression. He was calculating, always 3 steps ahead. But tonight he hadn't expected this. Eleanor placed her glass down, gently, her voice soft, laced with curiosity. "That's quite the statement. And yet, I don't recall ever hearing your name before." Victoria's eyes gleamed. She was enjoying this. "Oh, I wouldn't expect you to," she said, swirling her drink. "Nathaniel doesn't talk about his past, does he?" Silence. Eleanor shifted her gaze to her husband. "No," she murmured, her voice laced with feigned innocence. "He doesn't." Nathaniel exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down. "That's enough." Victoria's smirk widened. "Touched a nerve?" Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his tone dangerously smooth. "If you're here to stir up old rumors, Victoria, I suggest you reconsider. We wouldn't want to make a scene, now would we?" A threat. Subtle, wrapped in velvet, but a threat nonetheless. Victoria lifted a perfectly sculpted brow. "A scene?" She feigned amusement. "Oh, Nathaniel, if I wanted a scene, I would have gone straight to the press." Eleanor's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a woman from his past. She knew something. Victoria turned back to Eleanor, as if measuring her. "Tell me, Mrs. Grayson." Her voice dipped, dangerously soft. "Has he started leaving the house late at night?" Eleanor's breath caught. Victoria tilted her head. "Or maybe you've noticed he keeps certain doors locked." Nathaniel's hand curled into a fist beneath the table. And that's when Eleanor knew. Victoria wasn't lying. She had seen something. She knew something. Eleanor inhaled sharply, keeping her expression blank. "Why don't you tell me what you're really here for, Victoria?" Victoria studied her, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded envelope. She slid it across the table. "You'll want to read that," she said, her voice softer now. almost pitying. Nathaniel reached for it, but Eleanor was faster. She grabbed the envelope and held it close. Nathaniel's jaw tensed. Victoria leaned back, satisfied. "Enjoy your evening, darling." And then, just like that, she stood and walked away, disappearing into the elegant crowd. The tension at the table was suffocating. Eleanor could feel Nathaniel's gaze burning into her, but she didn't look at him. She simply held the envelope. And she knew whatever was inside would change everything. The car ride home was silent. Nathaniel's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched. Eleanor sat beside him, the envelope still clutched in her lap. She could feel the storm brewing beneath his skin. "She's lying," he said finally. Eleanor hummed. "Maybe." Nathaniel's fingers tightened around the wheel. "Whatever's in that envelope, it's meant to manipulate you," he continued. "She's playing a game." Eleanor turned her head slowly, watching him. "Is she?" Nathaniel's grip flexed. A beat of silence passed. Then, "Do you trust me?" The question was soft, dangerous. Eleanor swallowed. She had spent years trusting him, years believing in him. And now she wasn't sure if she was sitting next to the man she married. Or the man who had gotten away with murder. Eleanor looked down at the envelope, running her fingers over the edges. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I guess we'll find out." Nathaniel exhaled, long and slow. But he didn't argue. And that terrified her more than anything. The moment they arrived home, Eleanor locked herself in her study. Her fingers trembled as she tore open the envelope. The first thing she saw was a photograph. She sucked in a sharp breath. It was Isabel, but not like the pictures she had seen online. This one was different. It was taken the night she died. She was standing outside a house, dressed in an elegant evening gown, her eyes wide, her face pale. She looked frightened. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She flipped to the next page. A police report. Her hands shook as she scanned the words. Isabel Montgomery was last seen leaving a private gala on the night of August 14th. She appeared distressed, witnesses claiming she was arguing with an unidentified man. Security footage confirms that she entered a black car at approximately 11:37 p.m. The driver was never identified. At 12:15 a.m., she was found dead in her home. The case was closed due to lack of evidence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. Her eyes flickered to the bottom of the page. Last known call made from Isabel's phone. Nathaniel Grayson. A sickening realization slammed into her. He was the last person to talk to her before she died. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, bile rising in her throat. Had she married a murderer? A soft knock at the door made her jump. She shoved the papers back into the envelope, shoving it into her desk drawer just as... "Nathaniel," she breathed, forcing herself to stay calm. He stood in the doorway watching her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he stepped inside. His voice was smooth, unreadable. What was in the envelope? Eleanor's stomach churned. He knew. She forced a small smile. Nothing important. Nathaniel hummed, tilting his head. "Are you lying to me, darling?" Her breath hitched. Then he took a slow step forward, and another, until he was close enough that she could see the flicker of something dark in his eyes, something dangerous. His hand lifted, brushing against her cheek, his touch deceptively gentle. "I don't like secrets between us," he murmured. Eleanor swallowed hard. She had to be careful. She had to be smart. So she leaned into his touch, smiling softly. "Neither do I." Nathaniel studied her for a moment. Then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And Eleanor knew. He didn't believe her, not for a second. The house was silent, but Eleanor's heart was anything but. She stood in front of the mirror in their dimly lit bedroom, her hands gripping the edges of the dresser, her breath shallow. the weight of everything she had uncovered pressed against her chest like a vice. She had married a man with secrets so dark they could bury her alive. A man who had been the last person to speak to Isabel Montgomery before she died. A man who, just moments ago, had looked at her with the same gaze a hunter gives its prey. Her hands trembled as she turned off the bathroom light and stepped out into the bedroom. Nathaniel was already in bed, the sheets pulled halfway over his torso, his head resting against the pillows. He looked calm, like a man who hadn't spent the last 5 years lying to her. "Come to bed," he murmured, his voice smooth, inviting. Eleanor hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to, but she forced a smile, slipping under the covers beside him, her body stiff. Nathaniel reached for her, pulling her close, his fingers ghosting along her spine. His touch had once made her feel safe. Now it made her feel like she was drowning. His lips brushed against her ear. "I don't like it when you keep things from me, Eleanor." Her body tensed. She swallowed hard. "I know." He was testing her, waiting for her to break. So she did what she had learned to do best. She pretended. She turned in his arms, resting a hand on his chest, meeting his piercing gaze. "I love you, Nathaniel," she whispered. The words tasted like poison. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable, but then he smiled. A slow, satisfied smile. And that's when Eleanor knew. He thought he had won. But he hadn't, because Eleanor Grayson had spent the entire day preparing for this very moment. The sun had barely risen when she slipped out of bed, moving silently, cautiously. Nathaniel was still asleep, his breaths slow and steady. She had one chance, one shot to leave this house and never look back. She had texted Richard the night before, a single message. "Be ready, I have what we need." He had responded immediately. "I'll be waiting, just get out." Her escape was set. Eleanor grabbed the small duffel bag she had packed, heart pounding as she tiptoed toward the door. Her fingers had just wrapped around the doorknob when... Going somewhere? A shiver ran down her spine. She turned slowly. Nathaniel was sitting up in bed, watching her with an expression that sent ice through her veins. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been waiting. Eleanor forced a nervous laugh. I was just going to get some air." Nathaniel tilted his head, studying her. Then, in one fluid motion, he got out of bed and locked the door. Her stomach dropped. She took a step back. "Nathaniel." "Shh," he murmured, crossing the room, stopping just inches from her. His hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I told you," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "I don't like secrets between us." Eleanor's pulse thundered. He knew she was leaving. The game was over, and she had lost. Nathaniel's fingers trailed down her arm, reaching for her wrist, wrapping around it too tightly. A warning. "I think you should stay home today," he murmured. Eleanor swallowed, her mind racing. She had no weapon, no way to fight him. But she had one last move. Her eyes flickered to the bedside table, to his glass of water, the one she had drugged last night. She forced herself to look at him, feigning surrender. "Okay," she whispered. Nathaniel's grip loosened slightly. That was all she needed. In one swift motion, she lunged for the glass, knocking it into his chest. The water splashed over his skin, but she didn't stop. She shoved him back, hard, grabbing the lamp from the nightstand and smashing it over his head. Nathaniel stumbled. His hands clawed at the wall for balance, his eyes wild, his breath ragged. The drugs were kicking in, his limbs wavered, his movements slowed. Eleanor didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran. She yanked open the door, sprinting down the hallway, down the stairs, out of the house. Her lungs burned, her feet barely touching the pavement as she raced toward the black SUV parked down the street. The door flew open, and Richard grabbed her hand, pulling her inside. "Drive!" she gasped. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car sped away. Eleanor turned, looking back at the house. The house where she had spent 5 years living a lie. The house where Isabel had died, and in the window of their bedroom. Nathaniel stood. His face was pale, his body still weak from the drugs. But his eyes promised she hadn't seen the last of him. A cold shiver ran through Eleanor's spine. She turned away, staring ahead, her hands still trembling. Richard exhaled sharply. "You did it," he muttered. Eleanor closed her eyes. Had she? Had she really escaped? Or was this just the beginning? The wind howled through the open window, carrying a distant echo of a whisper she could almost hear. "He will never let you go." Eleanor tightened her jaw. Let him come. Because this time, she wouldn't be the victim. This time, she would be the one pulling the strings. And when he tried to come for her, she would finish what Isabel never got the chance to, for good.